are listening to the Tank Magazine podcast. In this episode, Adam Bychawski speaks to the author and poet Kapka Kassabova about her book, Border, Journey to the Edge of Europe. Combining memoir and myth, history and travel, the book is an exploration of the borderlands between Turkey, Greece and Bulgaria, where Kassabova spent her childhood. On her journey through the corners of Europe, Kassabova documents the tragic stories and mystical folklore of people whose lives have been irrevocably shaped by the borders that surround them.
Perhaps if you could begin by just explaining why you decided to embark on this journey to this specific part of Europe. What was it about these borderlands that interested you?
I've always had a fascination with borders because I grew up with borders in the sense that I grew up behind the Iron Curtain, the ultimate hard border of the Cold War, and I was very aware as a child and a young person of that fact that we were behind the border that we were not permitted to cross. And that was a kind of formative awareness. It formed my consciousness in some ways. So I was always going to return to that particular border. It was just a question of how to do it.
I think one thing that's particularly striking is the scope of the book, the historical scope rather. It's not just a kind of a history of the recent past. We're not just kind of dealing with the aftermath of the Yugoslav wars or of the Cold War. The kind of narrative that you draw goes all the way back to the ancient past, which I think perhaps many people will be much less familiar with. Why did you decide to delve that far into the past and into the book? And if you could perhaps also just explain the kind of ancient history in which kind of forms much of the narrative.
Yeah, it's the border realm is a kind of realm of its own, but it's also part of a much wider and older and deeper world, which precedes borders. It precedes not only 20th century nation-state borders in the Balkans, but political borders, full stop. And that's the world of antiquity. And we're dealing with the beginning of European civilization in terms of the ancient cultures that existed in that little corner of southeastern Europe. It's where this triple border is now, but in antiquity that was ancient Thrace, ancient Greece, a confluence of several civilizations that only disappeared gradually, fading away into each other as the Romans arrived, and then the Slavs, of course the Byzantines were there for a long time, then the Ottoman Turks in the 14th century, and Islam spread through the Balkans from then onwards for several centuries. And that takes us all the way to the 20th century and the birth of Balkan nationalisms, which is when this border zone became a border zone for the first time, really. So traveling in those worlds, there are also very sort of wild parts of Europe. Some of the last wildernesses, you might say, are to be found there in those mountain ranges of the border. Traveling there, I was very aware that I was dealing with I was trying to write stories that emerged from specific historic moments in time, but there was also timelessness to that landscape, and a kind of strange circularity to the way people narrated stories. And I wanted to somehow reflect the circular, non-linear nature of that in the book.
And in a sense, it often feels like history is repeating itself a lot.
history is quite literally repeating itself in the sense that where the old Iron Curtain passed, which was the focus of my interest. Now there is a new wall between Bulgaria and Turkey, and also between Greece and Turkey to stem the flow of refugees. So some of the areas I visited in the book are now unvisitable once again. And that's, I think such things are, history repeats itself when healing hasn't occurred properly. The new wounds open in the places where the old wounds are still kind of saturating, And I think the new wall between Bulgaria and Turkey is a kind of symbol of that, The old graves, remain anonymous, and the bones haven't been properly named in a way. And that was one of the things I wanted to do with this journey, with this book, to listen to people's stories while we still can, while there are those voices still to record. I had a sense of the significance of these stories, the ghostliness of that which remains unnamed, and that's how, in psychological terms and in historical terms, history repeats itself.
Perhaps if you wouldn't mind, if you could just explain the free kind of the structure of the book in a sense of the sort of the three regions that you kind of focus on.
Yeah, I guess I followed, in a sense, this is a travel narrative. It is the story of a journey that I undertook, even though I hope it's much more than a travel narrative. But it follows, I simply followed the natural sort of lay of the land, starting from the Black Sea, which for me was a natural starting point because I used to go on childhood holidays to the Black Sea, quite close to the Turkish border, in fact. So that's my starting point for the journey. And from the Black Sea, you suddenly enter these mountain ranges, which are probably the least known part of the Balkans, Stranja, shared by Bulgaria and Turkey. There are ancient tombs there, and there's a Mediterranean climate in that area, which is not typical for the Balkan Peninsula. And sort of deeply hidden, forgotten villages in these forests, in these mountain valleys. And from there, I went down into the plains of Thrace, and Thrace refers to a geographical area, but also to the ancient, now extinct civilization of the Thracians. Spartacus is perhaps the best known Thracian in history, who led the revolt against the Romans. And after that, the Rhodope Mountains, which straddle Bulgaria and the Bulgarian-Greek border. Again, a great wilderness, and also a kind of ghost land of empty villages, sort of whose destiny has been defined by the border and everything that has happened through the 20th century. Several wars, including one civil war in Greece, and then, of course, the Cold War. And I returned from there to the Black Sea, but on the Turkish side. I wanted very much my journey to reflect the mirror-like nature of the border as I saw it, how each story had its equivalent on the other side of the border.
You described the kind of ghost-like nature of a lot of these villages, and I think one of the recurrent stories is of people being displaced across the border, and sort of leaving their villages, and then a new set of displaced people kind of taking those villages up, and then there's a kind of sort of cycle of depopulation and repopulation. when you speak to these people, how do they kind of define themselves after these kind of cycles of continuous depopulation and displacement? What sort of sense of identity do they have?
Yeah, it's really interesting to ask that question of identity, cultural or even regional identity, or even, I wondered whether there was such a thing as a border identity. Did the people of the border see themselves as because to me the border realm was very different from anything else I'd experienced. Yet, to my surprise, I found that a lot of the people I met, the true people of the border, define themselves, perhaps not saying it in so many words, but you could see that in the way they lived and acted and spoke. A lot of people seem to define themselves by the things they loved, and because of the severe depopulation and kind of, you could almost say psychic devastation of those villages after subsequent sort of regimes and curfews and proper Cold War propaganda and urbanization as well in the latter 20th century. This sort of draining of the countryside. After all that, there seems to be a kind of a strange phenomenon among these people of how can I describe it? I met people who were almost like guardians of something they loved, something to do with the land. It was always about going back to the landscape, to a particular river of one's childhood, or in the case of one guy in Turkey on the Black Sea side. He's been a self-appointed guardian of this extraordinary Byzantine rock monastery, a carved rock monastery, which has been sort of left to sort of biodegrade. It's totally uncared for by the authorities, even though it's a cultural monument of some significance. This guy, who is a gypsy, has sat at the entrance of this rock monastery for 30 years. He's 50 now. It's completely unremunerated. He's doing it out of love because he grew up there, and he doesn't want the monastery to fall prey to, treasure hunters and drunken parties. So I met quite a few people like that who have found something they love and have dedicated themselves to it. And there is something very moving, very old-fashioned about that. These are unfashionable people in forgotten places who somehow, have found the inner strength or the inner resources to preserve something worth preserving, and that was very striking on each side of the border, where small communities, kind of decimated communities, kind of cling together, still telling stories, still keeping up some of the old rituals like the fire worship in that Bulgarian village I describe. Things which might have perished or faded away elsewhere are still preserved in these places, and I think that's part of the magnetism of that border for me.
Why do you think it is that these rituals are preserved? I think another example that you kind of detail in the book is villagers from one community traveling to a village across the border where generations before their great grandparents or grandparents lived. Why is it that sort of those kind of traditions endure, do you think?
Yeah, I think you're referring to that special form of ancestral tourism, which I think exists beyond the Balkans. I mean, in the case of the Balkans, I think it's the fact that it's so recent that these massive sort of population. It was called, the official term was exchange of populations after the Balkan Wars and the First World War. where literally, villages from each side of the border would go across into Turkey, for instance, and then, the populations of villages would be swapped across the border, which seems completely unnecessary when you look at it from a human point of view. And it was very traumatic, for great numbers of people to be uprooted so suddenly from a place where their families had lived for hundreds of years, just in the name of this new political border, a new entity called Republic of Turkey or Greece, which until then had been Ottoman, Ottoman territory, borderless. It's quite recent. It's within living memory. I think it's this desire that we, it's probably hardwired in our soul to go back to, where our ancestors came from, even if it's just sort of across the river, to maybe reconnect with something. And I do think people who are uprooted, I look at the refugees of today who, I met one Syrian guy in Bulgaria, a recent settler there since the Syrian war. He's my age, younger than me actually, and he said to me, I don't think that within my lifetime Syria will be inhabitable again, and to be living with that, and his children will carry that into their lives, this sense of dispossession. But I think in the Balkans, that's almost the norm, that everybody's grandparents or great-grandparents were at some point uprooted. And I think that plays a part in everything that is happening now. These things don't just go away because they're not discussed. They stay in the system, in the collective sort of system. And that's why I think these border stories are so important, because they're not about the past. They're about now and tomorrow.
A lot of the history in the book is based on oral histories, on interviews with the people that you come across in your journey, and sometimes these are stories that have been passed on by several generations. Why did you decide to focus on a bottom-up account of these border regions?
Yeah, I mean that is a very good. That's a good point and an important aspect of what I wanted to do. This experiential history, oral history, and also letting ordinary people speak, so-called ordinary people. I deliberately didn't want to be taken around by, local officials or mayors or because the official sources of history are always there for us to tap into. And I did read various books, various sources on aspects of history. That's always there, but some of it, especially in the Balkans, is extremely unreliable and one-sided. And some of the nationalistic narratives of history that circulate in countries like Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey now, and getting worse by the day in Turkey, but also in Bulgaria. Some of this new nationalism that's appearing is telling very poisonous stories about the recent past, which are contradicted as soon as you are on the ground talking to people who are actual witnesses and survivors of events. And that's why I wanted this to be a kind of, in a way, a people's history, very much tied in with the history of the land, of this landscape. I think I'm attracted to what's been called a slow geography approach to narratives, basing it on how people interact with the land where they live, and vice versa, how a certain landscape affects the people who live there, how it affected me as well as a person passing through as a kind of pilgrim on a pilgrim's journey. And some of those landscapes had a very powerful effect on me.
In what sense?
In the sense that a lot of these places in the border zone are haunted. You know, they are haunted by their empty houses, by their untold stories, by their unmarked graves, by the memories people hold in their bodies because they're not able to put them anywhere, because nobody has asked them about them before. You know, these so-called ordinary people actually are keepers of quite extraordinary stories, extraordinary truths. And I think most official historians, like most politicians, don't go to places like that border zone. And if they go, they are on an official visit. So I was very keen to experience and to write a kind of alternative, or if you like, shadow history of, among other things, the Cold War, but also of the Southeastern Balkans.
You described yourself just then as a pilgrim, and I wondered how you kind of saw your role to begin with before you embarked on this journey, and how perhaps after or in the midst of the journey that changed.
I think when you set off on a journey that's more than that's driven by more than curiosity, I think you're bound to get surprises, and so plans, you know, don't always work out. And so yes, I had planned to be more of a kind of recipient and collector of stories, more of an observer than a participant. But I found myself being sucked into some of these stories and some of these people's personalities, even some of the communities. I guess I became attached, you know, to places and even to people's suffering. I guess I felt quite connected. I felt I was part of it in a way. I was a stranger, but I was also, in a way, an insider, especially on the Bulgarian side, because I'd grown up in Bulgaria. So there was a kind of difficult balancing act for me throughout this journey, where I was emotionally very affected, at times drained, yet I had to sort of carry on and continuously say goodbye to people and places. And I think that's part of the border story as well. Separation and kind of going into the unknown. That's what border crossers do as well, you know, including today's refugees crossing this same border. They go into the unknown, almost like crossing the Styx, you know, into the other world. It's full of symbols, this border zone, you know. It's full of metaphors, which I think also apply to the rest of us and our lives, if we can extrapolate them.
Speaking of sort of symbols and metaphors, much of the book documents spiritual or perhaps pagan in some way beliefs and folklore. I think things from everything from kind of healing springs to mystical fireballs. Why is it that do you think that the border is this kind of repository of these sort of of this kind of folklore and of these kind of spiritual beliefs?
I think there's two things here. One is that because it's been a border zone, a restricted access zone for about 50 years, certain things became kind of frozen in time, almost preserved. And the other thing is that we're dealing with the Balkans, and I think in the Balkans, wherever you go, you find this incredible sort of confluence of ancient, pagan, superstitious, mystical, monotheistic, mix of mix of beliefs and ways of life. It's almost as if time planes are woven into a kind of story that feels out of time, mythical time. I'm applying, almost Jungian terminology here, talking about archetypes and symbols. But I think the Balkans are like that. That is their great cultural richness, and it's also been their great tragedy. So all of that I found in the border zone, because it's a border zone, but also because it's the Balkans. And it's also the wilderness aspect of it, the fact that these are mountain chains, which are difficult to cross, difficult to inhabit. There are bears and wolves. So naturally, a certain type of person is drawn to those places, as well as the locals who just happen to have washed up there since the last population exchange 100 years ago. So all of that I felt was incredibly rich material, and I'm grappling with some of that now with my new book as well.
You sort of get the sense, and I think that's just something that you sort of touch on or suggest in the book, that that these beliefs and traditions play almost a commemorative role in the communities that you come across. Is it in some ways a way of dealing with trauma, or perhaps dealing with the past in the way that these beliefs are sort of the last remnants of communities that have long been displaced?
Absolutely. I think you put it very nicely. It's almost, I guess, just as my book feels to me as a form of as a kind of cultural memorial, to the border and its people, but also to the Southeast Balkans. So some of these almost miraculously preserved practices and storytelling traditions are a form of memorial, a form of almost a healing kind of therapeutic practice that people have developed in the absence of all other healing or therapy or help or memorialization from the places of power, from the centers of power. And I think this does happen in older cultures as well as in forgotten places. If you go to the Scottish Isles, if you go, say, to Shetland or even to Orkney, you find a different way. People whose families have a history there, have a kind of ancestral memory there. You find a different way of remembering and narrating stories from the way we do in cities, in the same country, in the same culture. So I think it's to do with remoteness, and it's to do with oldness, with cultural accumulation. And I think the therapeutic healing side of it was very striking. How people forgotten by the world, forgotten by politicians and governments, with no infrastructure, their children gone abroad long ago, and their grandchildren are somehow self-healing through storytelling and through simple kind of rites, and through food, growing their own food, and being able to share that with the odd sort of visitor like me passing through with incredible generosity.
It's interesting because I think the commemorative aspect is one of it, but there's also one gets a sense of a kind of sort of stubbornness almost in the way that people kind of cling on to these beliefs. Is it perhaps also a kind of form of perhaps cultural resistance to the centre.
Yeah, cultural resistance to the center, as the center of power becomes more and more self-referential and cut off from the periphery. And of course, a border zone is a form of periphery, as well as, in more psychological and cultural sort of terms, a liminal zone, a kind of world between worlds. That particular zone, ironically, the people on each side of the border have more in common with each other than they do with their own compatriots from the city. So the Bulgarians of the border have more in common with their Turkish neighbors across the river than they do with the people of Istanbul and Sofia, because they share that landscape and they share that history. And the broken roads and the depopulated villages, and yes, you can say it's a form of cultural resistance because that's all they have. In a way, everything has been taken away from these communities. In the last 100 years, especially in the Cold War. And after the Cold War, actually, in the last 25 years, there's been further emigration and further neglect. So, having been plundered, of everything that has a material aspect, what can never be taken away from you is the immaterial wealth. And I think storytelling and the imagination, the collective imagination, is one of those things, and I was keen to tell those stories too, that still live in these old women's way of speaking, about flying dragons, which might be shooting stars, and so on. That is a form of wealth that no one can take from you.
Mm-hmm. I believe that you were undertaking this journey through Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey around the beginning of the migrant crisis. How do you see those, or how did you perhaps see those border communities beginning to be affected by that crisis, and in what ways do you think they will have become exacerbated?
Yeah, it was a poignant thing to realize that the refugees from the Middle East coming through these border villages, trying to cross into Europe, are witnessed by the people of the border villages who were themselves the descendants of refugees, and I think they're very aware of that. But there are also a lot of the locals were quite wary of these foreign sort of people coming in greater numbers. So there was a whole spectrum of reactions from actively welcoming people, trying to help them in some way, to indifference and wariness, to open hostility. And there were many ironies as well, because these villages are depopulated, so they could do with some newcomers. They could do with some new settlers, in fact. And in a Turkish border village where I met a couple of shepherds who are the last residents of that village. They live in the last house. All the other houses have been vacated or are just holiday houses. They said to me, we love it here. We grew up here. We've come back here to live in our old age. But why can't we have a few families, a few Syrian families that, they come through here all the time en route to Bulgaria, being often dumped by smugglers, after being robbed, of their savings. We could do with a few more families, we could bring the village back to life. And of course that makes total sense. And that is one of the ironies that, politicians in these countries, these border countries like Bulgaria and Greece, that are having to house refugees in camps. Some of these camps are like prisons. You know, they moan about being overwhelmed with refugees, but you know, if only they could think a bit more creatively. You know, some of the refugees can be resettled in otherwise dying beautiful villages and towns. But I think we're far from having politicians kind of implement such radically humane policies. But to me, it would make sense, and I think to some of the border people, it would make sense.
Is there a worry that these communities are going to suffer as a result of the hardening of borders?
Inevitably, I mean, I can't see anything positive coming out of these new shiny fences that have been built, you know, between the two EU countries and Turkey at great expense, with EU funds, of course. I can't see. I mean, yes, they might stop people from crossing, but that's not a positive result. You know, the locals, the people of the border, the communities of the border are not going to be reinvigorated by these new fences. And now, because of this new fence, it's become a militarized zone again. The Bulgarian side of the fence is now, you know, bristling with police, with border police again. So there's a strong sense of déjà vu, and that is going to discourage, you know, the little rural tourism that there was, because some of the hotels, you know, are full of soldiers or police. I just think this is the wrong kind of approach by both the Bulgarian and the Greek government. And it will play itself out in time, you know. I just don't think, having seen, you know, the physical remains of the Iron Curtain, of the border of my childhood, and how pathetic it looks now, I have seen the natural fate of borders, you know. They are destined to fall sooner or later.
Is there some sort of sense of a model of community within these border regions? I mean, I think it's incredible how resistant many of these communities are to being broken down by identity. I think you tell one story in the book about an Easter service in a border village where the congregation is split between Christians and Muslims. So, I mean, is there something that we can kind of learn here or take away from these communities?
Absolutely. It's the everyday reality of you know, cultures coexisting. In this case, Islam and Christianity, of course, underlined heavily with paganism in the case of the Southeast Balkans. But because people have lived side by side, you know, the mosque next to the church, since the 14th century, it is a natural thing to simply, you know, if you're a Muslim, go to the Easter service just to show neighborliness out of friendliness, because it's an occasion of celebration. And the same thing, you know, when there is a Qurban Bayram for the Muslims, you know, the Christians bring bread or cake or whatever, because that's how it was before, you know, I guess in pagan times, where a lot of these rituals come from, the painting of eggs and so on, at Easter. So it's no longer a purely sort of religious or political event. It's a neighborly event. It's about building a community and keeping it going. And I think there is something to learn from that. I just hope it's not destroyed. I mean, this goes on every day in most of the Balkans. I mean, the Yugoslav wars destroyed a lot of that, of course, in the former Yugoslavia. and sort of segregated communities, and the whole thing of ethnic cleansing also cleansed the culture of its richness. It stripped it, it pauperized it, and that is a great loss. But in the Balkans of my border, and in the Balkans that I'm writing about in my next book, which is about Macedonia and Albania, this kind of neighborliness is an everyday reality, and I hope it can be preserved.
I think you there is a specific word for it.
Yeah, komşu or komşuluk, which is another Turkish word that's been, I think, in circulation for several hundred years. The spirit of neighborliness, and it's in a way how the multiple cultures and ethnicities and religions of the Ottoman Empire lived largely peacefully for several hundred years through that spirit of neighborliness.
I have to ask, because there's some sections of the book in which you're reading and you're thinking, wow, I don't know if I'd necessarily be brave enough to make those journeys on my own. It often seems like you sometimes end up in situations that are perhaps a little bit hairy, perhaps a little bit uncomfortable. How do you deal with that as a writer? How do you deal with that on a kind of personal level?
I guess I had mixed feelings about this journey, in the sense that part of me was terrified and daunted by the kind of enormity of the task that lay ahead, but also the nature of the terrain, these mountain roads and sort of remote places and strange people that I was going to meet and did meet. But part of me kind of had a steely sense of resolve that I was going to go to almost any lengths to get the stories of the border. I wanted to find gold almost at any price. And I did, and I paid the price, you might say. But I was also, I guess, instinctively, aware that I can't simply write about this border academically from a completely safe, sort of detached observer's point of view. Not when I'm dealing with people's lives and deaths, which is what this border stands for. So in a way, I got to experience the border firsthand, and I'm glad I did.
To hear more podcasts from Tank Magazine, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.